She went to prison for his crime. 3 years later, she came home to find her 7-year-old son sitting on frozen steps, eating dry bread, because his new stepmother said he ate too much. Her husband? He'd remarried, erased her, and was living in the house she paid for. What she did next? She didn't seek revenge. She didn't have to, because sometimes, karma doesn't need your help. Before we begin, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This story will restore your faith in justice. I promise. Now, here's what happened. 5 years ago, Clara Bennett thought life was simple. Not perfect, but simple enough. She wasn't chasing wealth or trying to impress anyone. She just wanted a quiet, predictable life where her son felt safe, their home felt warm, and tomorrow didn't feel like a threat. Her mornings always started the same way. She'd wake up before everyone else, tiptoe into Ethan's room to make sure he was breathing, watching his tiny chest rise and fall. At 3 years old, he was still soft and small, still reaching for her when he was tired, still believing the world would be kind as long as Mama was near. She'd kiss his forehead and head to the kitchen, packing his breakfast and lunch while the house was still quiet. Damien would leave early, always dressed sharply, smelling of cologne and ambition. He talked constantly about work, about growth, about deals that were just on the verge of closing. Clara rarely understood the details, but she trusted him. He'd always been careful, precise, the kind of man who handled the future so she could focus on the present. The house was comfortable, nothing fancy. Bills got paid on time, groceries were always stocked, dinners were warm. Clara managed the money carefully, and Damien kept telling her she didn't need to worry. She believed him. She had to. Then one night, everything started to unravel. Damien came home unusually energized. He kissed her longer than usual and talked about landing the deal of his career. A multi-million-dollar investment contract. He described it as life-changing, something that would secure Ethan's future forever. Clara listened, feeling relief and pride mixing with awe. Finally, a moment where she wouldn't have to count every penny, calculate every risk, or wonder if something unexpected would ruin their carefully built life. She let herself believe that for once, security would be real. Then Damien mentioned the bank account. For tax purposes, he said casually, some money will need to move through your account temporarily. Just a formality. My lawyers recommend it. It won't take long. Clara hesitated. That account held everything important. The mortgage, daycare, their emergency savings. It wasn't just numbers on a screen. It was the foundation of their entire life. I'm not sure, she started. He didn't push. He didn't raise his voice. He just smiled, gently, reassuringly, and reminded her they were married. That this was for the family. She didn't need to understand all the technical stuff, just trust him. And she did. She gave him access, believing that trust between husband and wife was enough. She never signed documents she didn't read carefully. She never approved any illegal transfers. She only trusted the man she'd chosen, the man who'd promised to protect their world. For months, life went on as usual. Ethan learned new words, stumbled over sentences, laughed freely. Clara planned his birthdays, read him stories, and watched Damien work long hours, convinced that the transfers he explained as temporary were exactly that. She had no reason to doubt him. Then one morning, there was a knock at the door. It was louder than any knock she'd ever heard before. Clara opened it, holding Ethan in her arms. He rubbed his eyes, still half asleep, completely unaware that his life was about to change forever. 3 men stood there. Badges flashed. Names were called. Her name. She was under arrest. Clara's heart stopped. The world tilted, suddenly unfamiliar and threatening. She didn't understand any of it. There must be some mistake, she whispered. Ethan clutched her neck, too small to understand what was happening but old enough to feel the tension, the fear in the air. Clara tried to comfort him, but her voice shook, betraying her own panic. The agents didn't wait. They stepped past her, firm and precise. She looked toward Damien's car outside, hoping he'd appear, explain everything, protect them, stop this nightmare. But she didn't see him yet. And that's when she realized the world she'd trusted, the man she'd loved, the life she'd built, it might all have been a lie. The agents moved with quiet authority, stepping past Clara into the house without waiting for permission. Ethan clutched her neck, his small body trembling, eyes wide and confused. She whispered that everything would be okay, though she didn't know if she believed it herself. The world she trusted had just shattered in a single morning. At the station, the questions came fast. Every transaction, every account, every transfer traced back to her. Numbers, documents, digital trails, proof, they said, that she'd helped move millions in fraud. She answered as best she could, but she didn't have the facts. She hadn't signed those documents knowingly. She hadn't moved that money. She'd only trusted Damien. Hours later, Damien arrived, looking calm and composed, as though he'd been caught in the same storm. He hugged her briefly, murmuring that lawyers were ready, that the evidence would get sorted out, that this was all a mistake. His voice, so familiar and warm in her memories, should have reassured her. But now it just felt like betrayal. It became clear over the next few days that there was no mistake. Damien's name never appeared anywhere. He'd protected himself completely. Every transaction, every account, every offshore shell company traced entirely back to her. She'd been set up. Every step she'd taken, every moment she'd trusted him, had been used against her. In private, he explained, almost casually, the choice she had. She could claim ignorance and face prison while he made sure Ethan would be cared for. Or she could admit to acting alone, and he'd guarantee the boy's safety. Either way, she was taking the fall. Every instinct screamed that he was telling the truth. Every look, every word, every hesitation confirmed it. The courtroom was overwhelming. Polished wood and formal authority, the air thick with expectation. Damien played the part of the betrayed husband perfectly. Every pause, every glance toward the jury, every carefully timed tear was designed to convince them. Clara's lawyer, exhausted and underprepared, could do very little. The weight of the evidence, her name, her account, her social security number on every document, was crushing. Damien testified with precision. He spoke of betrayal, of trust broken, of love turned to lies. His voice shook at the right moments. His eyes filled with tears that seemed real. The jury watched. They believed him. The wife who'd once trusted blindly was now the villain. Clara felt the verdict like a physical blow. Guilty on all counts. She was going to prison for a crime she didn't commit. The words sank into her chest, pressing down like stones. She was leaving Ethan behind, leaving the home she'd built, leaving the life she'd known. Damien held her son instead, steady, controlling, making sure Clara's absence would feel complete. Ethan didn't cry. He couldn't fully understand. But he knew something had been taken from him. He clutched the locket she'd given him around his neck, a small picture of her inside. It was a secret he held close, the only connection he had left to her. That locket would become his anchor, a quiet rebellion against the absence forced on him. As Clara was led away, she whispered promises she wasn't sure she could keep. "I'll come back for you." Her arms were empty in the next second. The boy pulled away, held tight by the man she'd once trusted. She took one last look at him, memorizing the small curve of his cheek, the way his eyes held confusion, fear, and just a flicker of understanding that she was gone. The ride to prison was silent. Clara kept her hands in her lap, feeling every bump of the road, every turn, as though each movement would shake her back into the world she'd lost. She watched the sky change from gray to pale sunlight, thinking of Ethan, of the locket pressed against his chest, wondering how he'd cope in a world where she no longer had a place. Once inside, the cold hit her first. The metal doors, the sterile walls, the harsh fluorescent lights. Every sound echoed, every movement was watched, every action controlled. She learned quickly to keep her head down. To survive, she had to become invisible. She watched the other inmates, the guards, the routines. Every gesture, every glance, every interaction became a lesson in endurance. Weeks passed, then months. Each day became a fight to stay sane, a test of patience, a silent promise to herself and to Ethan. She wrote to him every chance she got, pouring her thoughts, her love, her hope onto paper, even though she knew most letters would never reach him. She imagined him pressing the envelopes to his cheek, seeing her handwriting, feeling her presence in the words she'd written for him. Michael, her younger brother, started visiting. He brought news, advice, reassurance. He'd been investigating Damien, documenting evidence of the fraud, building a plan to eventually restore justice. He reminded her to endure, to survive, to stay strong. Every visit was a lifeline, a whisper of hope in a world that seemed determined to break her. Prison changed her. She became quieter, sharper, more patient. She learned to watch, to endure, to survive. She learned that betrayal could be lived through, that absence could be survived, and that hope could grow even in the smallest moments. 3 years stretched ahead. Each day a repetition, each night a test, each thought a reminder of what she'd lost and what she had yet to reclaim. And with every moment, Clara carried the thought of Ethan in her chest, pressing against the pain, the injustice, and the betrayal. She would survive. She had to. Because when the day came that those doors opened again, she planned to reclaim everything, her life, her son, and the justice that had been stolen. Prison was a world Clara had never imagined existed. The metal doors slammed like thunder, echoing down long grey corridors. Lights flickered constantly, bathing the cells in pale, harsh glare. Every day had a rhythm, measured in steps, locks, and counts. There was no privacy, no quiet, just the constant feeling of being watched, measured, judged. She learned quickly that survival wasn't about fighting back. It was about endurance. Some inmates pitied her. Some hated her. Guards treated her like the criminal the world had declared her to be. She became small, quiet, always watching, always learning. Every glance, every gesture became a lesson. But her mind never left Ethan. At first, she imagined him at 3, his tiny hands reaching for her, his soft cheek pressed to hers. She pictured the locket she'd given him, with a small photograph of her tucked inside, safely against his chest. A secret token of their bond. She imagined him holding it whenever he felt scared, pressing it close, knowing she loved him even when she wasn't there. Letters became her lifeline. Every week, she wrote long, carefully worded messages, explaining how much she loved him, how she was fighting to come back, and how he needed to always remember that Mama hadn't abandoned him. She imagined him seeing her name on the envelopes, feeling the weight and meaning of it, even if he couldn't read the words yet. Damien intercepted many of them, controlling what reached him, keeping their connection partial and fragile. But she kept writing, because each letter was an act of defiance, proof that her presence couldn't be fully erased. Ethan, now 4, learned to carry the absence with him. He clutched that locket constantly. He'd caught glimpses of some letters before they were taken away. The sight of his name in her handwriting left something stirring inside him he couldn't explain. He didn't need to read them to understand she existed somewhere beyond the walls of his home, somewhere beyond the reach of the woman who'd replaced her. That locket became his anchor, his secret, the closest thing he had to holding her. Clara survived each day by counting steps, counting meals, counting hours until she could sleep and dream of Ethan. She watched other women, other lives, the routines and hierarchies of prison. She became patient, quiet, calculating. The world had taken everything from her, but it couldn't take her determination. Every small act of survival, every careful interaction, every choice she made became part of her armor. Michael became her connection to life outside. He visited when he could, bringing news and hope. He told her Damien was being investigated quietly, that evidence was slowly being collected, that justice was possible. But timing was delicate. Damien had lawyers, connections, influence. Michael reminded her to survive, to endure, to stay quiet and strategic. Every piece of advice was another thread of hope, a promise that this story wasn't finished yet. Clara's world was grey, repetitive, harsh. She learned to measure each day, to save her energy, to keep her mind alive while her body endured the cold and the hunger. Letters to Michael became her second lifeline. She detailed every observation, every feeling, every small victory of patience. Michael sent back guidance, plans, reassurance. Together, they built a silent strategy for the moment her freedom would return. Ethan's presence in her thoughts kept her going. She imagined him sleeping, playing, holding the locket, learning to live without her but never forgetting. She imagined the moment they'd reunite, him running into her arms, the locket swinging, that small curve of his mouth lighting up with recognition. The warmth of a mother finally returned. That day became her anchor, her goal, her reason to endure the gray, the endless repetition, the cold walls. 3 years stretched ahead, each day blending into the next. Clara kept writing, kept enduring, kept surviving. She learned the strength of patience. She learned the power of quiet resistance. The betrayal of Damien, the loss of her son, the false conviction. None of it could break the bond she carried in her chest, the love that had become her most important survival tool. The routine became her meditation. Wake, count, watch, endure. Write letters, imagine her son, learn the small rhythms of survival. She didn't let herself dwell on rage, except in small, controlled moments that made her stronger. Rage without control was dangerous. It could destroy her. But controlled, it became fuel. A reminder that she would return. That she'd reclaim what was stolen. And finally, the day came. The gates opened, the world outside spilling light into her eyes. Clara stepped out of prison, the sun warming her face, the air smelling of freedom, of possibility. She carried 3 years of survival in her bones. 3 years of patience, endurance, and love. 3 years of imagining Ethan clutching that locket, waiting, remembering, hoping. She walked forward, determined. Not for revenge. Not yet. Not blindly. She walked forward to reclaim her life, to get her son back, to face Damien and the world that had tried to erase her. Prison had tested her, shaped her, made her stronger. And with every step, she carried the thought of Ethan in her heart. Small, fragile, unbroken, waiting for her. She wouldn't fail him. She wouldn't fail herself. Because the bond between a mother and her child can't be broken, no matter how many walls, how many lies, how many years separate them. Batch 4, the return, divorce and custody loss. The moment Clara stepped outside those prison gates, the air hit her like a promise. Cold, sharp, real. She breathed in deeply, tasting freedom she hadn't touched in 3 years. Every step toward the car waiting for her felt surreal, the sunlight heavy with possibility. Michael was there, calm and collected, holding the keys to a car that would carry her not just through streets, but toward a new chapter, toward a fight she'd been preparing for quietly, relentlessly, every single day behind those steel bars. She didn't think about Damien right away. Not yet. Her mind was on Ethan. She pictured him, now 7, clutching the locket she'd given him. She imagined the confusion on his face, the moment he'd recognize her again. She imagined running into his arms, holding him tight, feeling the years between them like a weight finally lifted. But the reality waiting for her was sharper than any dream. She pulled up to the house she'd called home for years, a house that had once been filled with laughter, warmth, and the small chaos of family life. The door opened before she could even knock. And there she was, Vivian Carter. Vivian was calm, composed, beautiful, and disturbingly at ease in the life Clara had built. "I'm his wife now," she said simply, as though that statement alone erased the past. "This is our home." Clara's heart dropped. The home she'd defended, the life she'd given everything for, now belonged to someone else. The walls that had held her family, her memories, her son, had been claimed in her absence. Damien appeared then, casual and practiced, handing her papers she didn't want to see but had to look at. Divorce. Finalized 6 months ago. While she'd been behind bars, her legal existence in that household had been erased. She couldn't dispute it. She could only take it in. The custody papers followed. Damien had full legal custody of Ethan. Clara could have supervised visits, once a month, an hour at a time, controlled by the man who'd betrayed her so completely. The realization hit harder than prison ever had. She'd survived 3 years of punishment for a crime she didn't commit, and the world had just moved on without her. Inside the house, Clara caught sight of another child. A little girl, laughing, running through the dining room, safe, fed, cared for. Vivian's daughter, Isabel. She was living in the life Clara had left behind, sharing the table, filling the spaces Clara had once claimed. Every instinct in her screamed in disbelief and anger. She confronted Damien. "What about the truth?" she asked quietly, each word heavy. He smiled, cold and indifferent. "Prove it," he said. The challenge was impossible. Every paper, every transaction, every document was designed to protect him and condemn her. She had no evidence, no leverage, no legal ground to stand on. The choice was brutal. Sign the custody papers accepting his arrangement, or risk never seeing Ethan again. She signed. Her hands shook, but she held herself together, kneeling briefly beside Ethan. His small face lifted to hers, confusion and recognition mixing in his eyes. "When?" he whispered, and the question nearly broke her. She could only murmur, "Soon, I promise. I'll come back for you." Leaving that house was harder than any prison sentence had been. Each step outside pressed against her chest, a reminder that the life she'd known, the son she'd raised, was now partially out of reach. But every step also carried resolve. She'd survived a betrayal designed to destroy her. She wouldn't let this be the end. Across town, Michael sat in his penthouse office, reviewing files, financial statements, communications, evidence, patterns, proof of Damien's long history of fraud and lies. The tools were in place. The plan had been ready for years, built patiently while Clara endured what had been forced on her. Michael made the call. "She's out. It's time to begin." For the first time in weeks, Clara allowed herself a breath that felt like hope. She'd survived the impossible. She'd endured the betrayal, the prison, the absence. And now she was going to act. Every moment in that house, every paper signed, every injustice endured, had led to this point. Her first stop was a motel room Michael had prepared, a temporary place where she could breathe without the shadow of Damien's control. There, she unpacked not just her belongings, but pieces of herself she'd stored away during years behind bars. Letters, photographs, memories, all reminders of what had been stolen, and what she planned to reclaim. Ethan would come next. She imagined holding him, feeling the weight of lost years melt into arms that would never let go. And that locket, still pressed against his chest, still carrying a photograph of her face, would finally serve its purpose. Clara knew the road ahead wouldn't be simple. Custody battles, legal challenges, and the shadow of Damien's influence would stand in her way. But for the first time in years, she felt a surge of determination. She would rebuild. She would reclaim. She wouldn't just survive, she'd win. And somewhere in that calm before the storm, she allowed herself one quiet thought. The man who'd betrayed her, who'd taken her son and framed her for his crimes, would face a reckoning. She didn't know exactly how or when, but the plan had been in motion for years, and the first moves were finally being made. Clara stepped into that motel room, closing the door behind her. For the first time in 3 years, she was free, but the real fight was only beginning, and she would meet it head-on. Clara, meanwhile, wasn't watching him. She didn't need to. Her life was taking shape, grounded in stability rather than chaos. Morning coffee, work, therapy, supervised visits with Ethan that gradually increased to twice a month as the social worker's reports confirmed his improvement. Every visit, every smile, every small laugh from Ethan reinforced the life she was reclaiming, brick by brick. Vivian, who'd once felt secure in the life Damien provided, started noticing cracks. Damien came home tense, snapping at small things, eyes darting over documents with frustration he couldn't hide. The money she'd relied on to maintain her lifestyle was slipping away, and the man she'd married for stability was falling apart before her eyes. She watched quietly, packing bags in secret, making calls she'd put off, preparing backup plans. Damien refused to see the pattern forming around him. He blamed staff, partners, the economy, even imagined that Clara somehow had influence from prison. He couldn't understand that his careful empire, built on manipulation and lies, was facing disruption not from outside forces but from the simple fact that justice was catching up. The problems got worse. Within weeks, 3 major investors pulled their support, questioning inconsistencies they'd once overlooked. A bank froze 2 accounts. Regulators requested audits. Minor errors that Damien had always dismissed now became huge problems. Each domino fell slowly but steadily, a silent unraveling of the control he'd thought was unshakable. Across town, Clara watched her world become solid. She didn't need to check his balance sheets or read his emails. She focused on what she could see: Ethan gaining weight, laughing freely, discovering a childhood that had been denied to him. His locket, always around his neck, stayed a small reminder that she'd never truly left him, even when they were separated by miles and iron bars. Michael kept working on the next phase. The evidence he'd gathered over years, the careful documentation of Damien's schemes, the quiet accumulation of witnesses and records, all were now in play. He didn't rush. He never had. Damien's panic and inability to understand what was happening made the strategy work. Patience, years in the making, was paying off. Vivian's doubts turned into action. She realized her security didn't depend on loyalty to Damien, but on recognizing the collapse before her. She made calls to lawyers, arranged her departure, packed her bags carefully, and left a note explaining her absence. The man who'd once controlled her life now faced emptiness in the home he'd claimed, both in presence and support. Damien came home one morning to an eerily quiet mansion. No car in the driveway, no laughter from the children's rooms, no greeting from Vivian. Only silence. The echo of the front door swinging shut in his absence rang through the halls, a sound he'd never imagined would bother him. For the first time, Damien Bennett felt powerless. Meanwhile, the first hints of official intervention started taking shape. Detective Sarah Martinez opened a file marked Bennett Capital, Fraud Investigation. Anonymous tips, detailed evidence, and witnesses had arrived in her inbox, all pointing to long-term financial lies. Unlike other white-collar cases, this one had been prepared carefully by someone who understood the system, someone patient enough to gather what was needed over years. Clara, focused on rebuilding, didn't know the exact details. She had her hands full with work, therapy, Ethan, preparing the home for a life that had been paused for 3 years. But the signs of Damien's unraveling reached her indirectly. Calls from Michael, updates about investors questioning accounts, and the subtle shift in Vivian's behavior all hinted at what was coming. Her own life, by contrast, moved forward steadily. The apartment she'd prepared became a sanctuary. Ethan's room, carefully arranged with toys, books, and reminders of her presence, grew more familiar each day. Supervised visits turned into moments of trust and joy. She felt the slow but steady return of normal, the rebuilding of what Damien had tried to erase. And Damien, once untouchable, started to notice. He no longer controlled the story. Every decision, every transaction, every connection he'd once manipulated now had consequences he couldn't predict. Emails, audits, phone calls, subtle shifts in investor confidence, all piled up into pressure he couldn't manage. Clara never needed to step in directly. Her presence, her consistency, her regained stability, and Michael's careful work were enough. Damien's empire, built on manipulation and lies, couldn't survive the slow unraveling of truth, the patient accumulation of evidence, and the growing strength of the woman he'd betrayed. By the end of the month, Damien's confidence was shaken. Sleep came in short bursts. Every call from an investor, every flagged account, every unexpected audit sent waves of panic through him. The control he'd relied on for decades was slipping, and he couldn't stop it. Clara, on the other hand, sat at her desk one morning, coffee warm in her hands, Ethan reading a book across the room. She breathed in quietly, listening to the soft laughter, the calm rhythm of life rebuilding. The world she'd imagined while imprisoned was taking shape. Damien's unraveling was no longer theoretical. It was happening, and she was ready to claim what had been stolen from her. Damien Bennett had always believed he was untouchable. The deals, the accounts, the careful web of lies, he thought nothing could reach him. And for years, it had worked. But control is fragile and temporary, and the world had started to show cracks he couldn't ignore anymore. It began with small things. Calls from auditors, emails flagged by banks, questions from investors that hinted at problems. Damien had tried to dismiss them, but the cracks widened, spreading like frost across a window. Each minor problem led to another. Unchecked, invisible, unavoidable. Detective Sarah Martinez had been watching quietly, patiently, waiting for the right moment. White-collar crime was rarely dramatic, but the Bennett case was different. Someone had handed her the evidence perfectly documented, a map of lies spanning years, connecting transfers, shell companies, and witnesses. She didn't need to chase it down. It was already laid out perfectly. The call came to Clara first. "Ms. Bennett," Detective Martinez said, "we're reopening your case. New evidence suggests you were wrongly convicted, and Damien Bennett will be arrested." Clara sat frozen for a moment, disbelief mixing with careful hope. She'd spent 3 years imprisoned for his crimes, and now the system she'd once relied on to condemn her was finally turning in her favor. The investigation showed more than anyone expected. Damien's schemes weren't isolated. 6 other families had been used as pawns in his financial games, set up to take the fall while he walked free. Clara had been the most visible, the most dramatic, the one whose collapse would make sure no one looked too closely at him. The arrest was methodical, precise, but dramatic enough to leave a mark. Federal agents walked into Damien's office one Wednesday morning, badges out, evidence in hand. Staff froze, witnesses watched in disbelief, and Damien's face, once confident and untouchable, went pale. By evening, the footage had spread. Damien Bennett, the man who'd sent his own wife to prison, being led away in handcuffs, calm on the outside but defeated inside. Across social media, the comments poured in. Karma is real. Finally, justice. He can't manipulate his way out this time. Clara didn't feel triumph. She felt relief. Exhaustion and relief tangled together like 2 opposing currents. Damien's power was gone, and the shadow he'd cast over her life and Ethan's had finally lifted. With Damien detained, the court moved quickly. An emergency family hearing was called to decide Ethan's custody. Temporary foster care was suggested, but Clara's legal team acted fast, presenting every piece of evidence she had: the social worker's reports, her consistent therapy, her stable life after release. The contrast between Damien's neglect and her care was undeniable. Ethan, still holding tight to his locket, watched quietly as the room moved around him. He didn't fully understand the details yet, but he knew one thing: Mama was back, and the man who'd controlled their lives couldn't touch them anymore. The judge reviewed the files carefully. She looked at Clara's progress, her stability, the documentation of neglect, and Damien's arrest record. Then she made her decision. Full custody granted to Ms. Bennett, effective immediately, the judge announced. The words hit Clara like a wave. She could breathe, finally. The system had recognized her truth, the evidence had been clear, and she could take Ethan home. Michael was waiting outside, calm as ever. He'd planned the long game, making sure every detail was prepared for this moment. He didn't need to speak. His presence, steady and unchanging, was enough. Clara gathered Ethan in her arms, holding him close, letting the small weight of years lost press into her heart. He held her just as tightly, small arms wrapping around her neck, the locket swinging gently against her chest. She whispered promises she'd rehearsed for years but never spoken aloud. She would protect him, feed him, care for him, love him without limits. They left the courthouse together, the world suddenly open, the air fresh and unclaimed by fear. Damien's absence was a shadow behind them, but the light ahead was undeniable. Clara had fought for this moment, survived the impossible, and reclaimed what had been stolen. The road ahead wouldn't be without challenges. Damien's empire would keep unraveling, and legal battles would continue. But Clara no longer feared the future. She had strength, she had Michael's guidance, and she had her son in her arms. For the first time in years, she allowed herself a quiet sense of victory. Not revenge, not anger, but the deep satisfaction of justice delivered. Damien had fallen. The system, once blind to her suffering, had finally recognized the truth. And Clara was ready to rebuild the life she'd lost, not as a victim but as a mother and a survivor. That evening, as they drove home, Ethan rested against her, the locket pressed to her chest, and Clara looked at the apartment they'd soon enter. A space filled with hope, stability, and love she'd fought to reclaim. The fight wasn't over. Damien's influence would linger, whispers of the past would echo, and rebuilding would take time. But she had her son back. That was everything. And somewhere, quietly, she allowed herself to imagine the future. A life restored, a home rebuilt, a family healed. Damien's arrest wasn't the end of her story. It was the end of his power over her. Clara Bennett had endured the impossible. And now, she was free to live the life she'd earned. Clara drove slowly through the familiar streets, Ethan pressed against her side in the passenger seat. The locket around his neck swung gently as he held it tight, a silent link to the years they'd lost. The apartment waited ahead, but for the first time in years, it felt like home rather than just a place she lived. Ethan's small hand finally slipped into hers. He didn't speak much, didn't need to. The tension of years apart hung in the air between them. He knew, without words, that this moment was his again. That he was safe. That Mama was back. When they arrived, the apartment felt brighter than she remembered. She'd prepared it carefully, even before her release. Small touches, a colorful rug, books stacked neatly on shelves, toys arranged in corners, made it a home, not just a space. Ethan's eyes widened, and for the first time, a real smile spread across his face. "Am I really coming home with you?" he asked softly. "Yes," Clara said, her voice steady though her chest ached. "Really? For good? Forever?" He ran into her arms, and this time, there were no walls between them, no time limits, no supervision. Only the embrace they'd both longed for. Even as she settled into the apartment, Clara's mind stayed alert. Damien's empire was crumbling, but his shadow lingered. Investors had pulled out, accounts were frozen, and investigations had begun. Each day, she felt quiet satisfaction knowing that the system was correcting the imbalance Damien had created. The first nights were quiet, almost fragile. Ethan slept in his own bed, the locket tucked under his pillow, while Clara watched from the doorway, remembering every letter she'd written, every imagined touch, every hope she'd sent across the miles. Now he was here, alive and whole, and she could finally start undoing the years of absence. Work became a rhythm, grounding her. Sandra, her boss at the marketing firm, had given her responsibilities that let her shine. Clara worked hard, proving that her time away hadn't broken her spirit, only sharpened her determination. Slowly, she gained confidence again, building not just a career but a foundation for the life she'd fought for. Ethan adjusted too. At first, he was careful, scanning rooms and faces, remembering the controlled visits that had filled his childhood for so long. But laughter started to return, careful at first, then freely, as he discovered a world without fear. The locket stayed his constant companion, a real piece of the mother he'd loved but barely known. Then came Isabel. Clara learned through the social worker that Damien's daughter, left behind after Vivian's departure, had no family willing to take her. The little girl, scared and alone, had been placed in foster care. Her heart ached at the thought of a child suffering because of Damien's manipulation, because of a system that had once failed her. She decided, quietly but firmly, that she'd take responsibility. The first visit was careful. Isabel held tight to her stuffed rabbit, eyes wide, suspicious. Clara knelt, keeping her distance, letting the little girl see that she wasn't a threat. "Hi, Isabel," Clara said softly. "I wanted to make sure you're okay." "Did I do something wrong?" Isabel asked, voice small and careful. "No," Clara replied firmly. "Nothing you did. This wasn't your fault." Slowly, over the weeks, trust started building. Isabel started visiting twice a week, first for an hour, then longer. Clara read to her, played gently, let her take the lead. The little girl, scarred by abandonment and neglect, started to soften. Laughter crept in, careful but real, a healing sound in Clara's home. Ethan watched quietly at first, then joined in. He explained games, offered her toys, showed her the apartment. In small ways, he became her guide to a world Isabel didn't know yet. Clara watched the two children, amazed at the strength of the human heart, the way life could start again if cared for carefully. Meanwhile, Damien's world kept collapsing. Investigations, audits, and legal action piled up. His offices were emptying, staff abandoning him. His empire, built on manipulation, crumbled like sand slipping through his fingers. And yet, he stayed a distant threat, a reminder of the power that had once stolen years from Clara and Ethan. Clara didn't focus on revenge. She focused on what she could shape: a home, a family, and healing. Slowly, intentionally, she rebuilt their lives. Meals shared together, bedtime stories, morning routines, all became rituals of recovery. She built stability in a way she'd never realized was possible until it was taken from her. Michael stayed a steady presence, guiding her, advising, making sure every step she took was safe, legally and emotionally. His preparation had set the stage for Damien's arrest, but he let Clara live fully in the moment, to enjoy the quiet victories of reclaiming her son and building a home. 6 months passed. Isabel became part of the family permanently. Adoption proceedings moved forward quietly, carefully, making sure the child would have security and love. Clara watched Ethan and Isabel together, laughter spilling into the apartment like sunlight. She couldn't undo the past, but she could build a future. And finally, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, Clara sat on the couch, Ethan on one side, Isabel on the other. They were surrounded by the small details of everyday life: books, toys, soft blankets, meals shared without rush. She allowed herself to breathe fully, to feel the weight of years lost now replaced by presence, connection, and love. For the first time, she understood that reclaiming everything wasn't about revenge or even justice. It was about restoration. About creating a life that no one could take away, no matter the shadows of the past. Damien's arrest, the unraveling of his empire, the empty halls of his mansion, all were distant echoes. Clara had reclaimed what mattered most: her children, her home, her peace. Clara Bennett had returned. Not as a victim, not as a prisoner of circumstance, but as a mother, a protector, and a woman who'd endured and survived. The locket around Ethan's neck was more than jewelry. It was a symbol of continuity, a promise that love, once planted, could endure absence and reclaim what was lost. And as the children laughed and played, Clara allowed herself a rare smile, quiet but full of certainty. This was the life she'd fought for. This was the life she'd earned. 1 year had passed since Clara had walked out of prison and reclaimed her son. The apartment, once quiet and tense, was now alive with laughter and movement. Balloons filled the living room, a cake sat on the table, and 2 children chased each other around the space without care, without fear. Ethan turned 8 that day. His hair was longer, curls soft and free, eyes bright with excitement. He laughed freely, a sound Clara hadn't heard in years, and it filled her heart with a warmth she'd almost forgotten. Isabel followed close behind, clutching her rabbit, eyes wide with wonder at the small celebration Clara had arranged. Clara watched from the kitchen, a mug of coffee in her hands, her chest tight with emotion. She'd spent years preparing for this life without knowing it would feel so real. The routines, the ordinary moments, the laughter, they were all proof that healing was possible. Her career had grown as well. The marketing firm had recognized her skill and determination. Promotions came steadily, each one earned through effort and creativity, not handed down through influence or manipulation. She now led a small team, guiding campaigns, mentoring younger staff, and earning the respect of colleagues who'd once questioned her abilities. The work gave her purpose beyond motherhood, a sense of identity she'd feared was lost forever. Therapy had become a steady anchor. Clara still carried the weight of her past, the betrayal, the prison years, but she'd learned to manage the trauma. Nightmares came less often. The locket around Ethan's neck stayed a daily reminder of the bond that could never be broken. Small moments, like watching him run to greet her after school or seeing Isabel laugh freely, reinforced the life she'd fought to rebuild. David, the man she'd met after her release, had become a quiet presence. He didn't rush. He didn't demand. He offered humor, kindness, and support. Clara had learned to take love slowly, to trust carefully, but she allowed herself to feel hope for the first time in years. Michael stayed a constant, the silent architect behind much of Damien's downfall and her rise. He was big Uncle Michael to the children, bringing gifts, telling stories, and keeping a watchful eye on their progress. Clara leaned on him as both family and advisor, grateful for his presence and guidance. It was during this peaceful morning that Michael asked to speak with her privately. Clara followed him into the hallway, her heart calm but curious. "There's someone I want you to meet," Michael said quietly. His eyes were serious, hesitant, a flicker of tension in his expression. "Someone important. Someone I'm planning to marry." Clara blinked, caught off guard. Her mind raced. Michael had always been careful, deliberate. This wasn't casual. She waited for more. "Who is she?" Clara asked, her voice steady but sharp with curiosity. Michael hesitated, then led her to the door. He opened it slowly, and there she stood. Vivian Carter. Time had changed her. She looked older, yes, but also tired, deliberate, and measured. Not the woman who'd invaded Clara's home, not the one who'd taken her place, but someone different. Clara froze. The room went silent. Ethan stopped mid-run, watching his mother closely. Isabel clutched her rabbit, sensing tension, eyes wide. Vivian's gaze didn't wander, didn't plead. She simply stood, waiting. Clara's mind raced, every memory of betrayal flashing. Damien's lies, prison walls, lost years, stolen mornings, letters she'd written that never reached her son. And yet, there was a pause, a hesitation in Vivian's posture that hinted at change, at something Clara didn't understand yet. For the first time, the past collided with the present, forcing Clara to measure not just what had been lost but what could be considered for the future. The children, innocent in all of this, stood at the center. Ethan, still holding the locket, looked to his mother. Isabel, uncertain but trusting, pressed against Clara. Clara realized then that this moment wasn't about revenge. It was about boundaries, protection, and the fragile possibility that people could change. Vivian had once taken her place, but now she was simply a woman seeking redemption, asking for entry that Clara had the power to allow or deny. She stood silently for a moment, letting the weight of the room settle. Vivian waited. Ethan and Isabel watched. Michael's eyes were steady, waiting for Clara to set the rules. This was more than a reunion. It was a test of power, of judgment, and of the capacity to forgive without compromising what she'd built. The past couldn't be undone, but the future could still be shaped. Clara knew she'd survived the impossible, rebuilt a life, and secured her children's safety. Vivian's presence, though tense, didn't have to undo that. Clara could set the terms, define the boundaries, and protect her family. She breathed slowly, feeling the steady rhythm of her heart. 1 year had passed, and every brick of this life had been earned. Damien's empire was gone. His control had evaporated. The children were safe, laughter filled the apartment, and the future, uncertain as it might be, was finally theirs to claim. Clara Bennett had reclaimed her life. She'd survived betrayal, injustice, and loss. And now, she faced the challenge of forgiveness, boundaries, and understanding that some people could change, but only under her terms. The room stayed still. Vivian's gaze met hers, quiet and measured. Clara's eyes softened, not in trust yet, but in observation. She would watch. She would decide. But the children were hers, her home was hers, and for the first time in years, she could breathe without fear. Outside, sunlight streamed through the windows, catching the dust in the air like tiny stars. 1 year later, and Clara had everything she'd fought to regain. Her children, her home, her peace. And the first test of the next chapter of life was standing at the doorway, waiting. The apartment was unusually quiet that evening. Ethan and Isabel had gone to bed early, their laughter lingering faintly like echoes of a happier world. Clara sat at the edge of the couch, shoulders tense, hands folded in her lap. Vivian had left after the brief, loaded meeting earlier, but the tension she'd left behind stayed, thick and heavy, settling over the space like dust that wouldn't lift. Michael approached, his eyes careful. He didn't rush to speak. He'd seen the fire in Clara over the years, the protective instinct she carried for her children. But he needed her to understand, to consider what he'd told her hours ago. "She's different," he said finally, quiet but firm. "Vivian is trying. She's in therapy, volunteering, trying to make up for her mistakes. I want you to meet her in a way that's controlled, safe." Clara's hands tightened around her mug, knuckles white. The word trying felt like both a warning and an insult. She'd lived through lies, betrayal, and imprisonment. Could someone like Vivian really change? Could she be trusted with the shadow of the past, even indirectly, around Ethan and Isabel? She thought of the years stolen from her, the cold emptiness of prison walls, the moments she'd imagined, held letters in her mind, and prayed her son would remember her. And now Vivian, the woman who'd replaced her, stood at the edge of their lives again. Clara remembered the children's reactions. Ethan's careful curiosity, Isabel's wide-eyed fear. Both depended on her, trusted her judgment. And she couldn't fail them. Michael's voice broke through her thoughts. "I'm asking you to think about this as their mother, not as the woman who was betrayed. If anyone is going to decide what's best for them, it's you." Clara looked toward the window, the city lights blurred through the glass, distant and calm. She imagined the years ahead, Ethan growing taller, Isabel learning to trust without fear, a life rebuilt from fragments of what had been taken. Could Vivian fit into that? Could she ever be a safe presence? Or would she always be a reminder of what was lost? Silence stretched between them. Clara's mind wandered to Damien's betrayal, the years she'd spent in prison, and the slow process of reclaiming her life. Yet, despite everything, there was a part of her that understood Michael's perspective. People could change. Circumstances could shift. The children's happiness could grow if the adults around them acted with honesty and care. Ethan's small voice echoed in her memory. "Mama, you taught me everyone deserves a second chance." She remembered Isabel's hesitant trust, the small hands reaching for hers, the gentle steps toward love she'd coaxed from the girl. And yet, there was the shadow of the past. The memory of letters never delivered, of stolen moments, of Damien's calculated cruelty. Could she risk allowing someone with a history so tangled with betrayal near her children again? Clara's hands tightened around the mug, feeling the warmth seep slowly into her palms. She took a deep breath and let it out slowly, willing herself to balance anger and caution, hurt and understanding. Michael stayed patient. He didn't push. He didn't offer promises. He simply watched, letting Clara make her own decision, knowing she'd endured more than most could imagine. Outside, the city pulsed with life, unaware of the quiet tension in a small apartment. And inside, Clara sat, weighing every moment, every possibility, every risk. There was no guidebook for forgiveness, no rule for redemption. There was only her judgment, her children, and the uncertain path ahead. Time passed, measured in slow heartbeats and the occasional creak of the apartment settling. Clara considered the open questions. Could Vivian be a part of their lives without disrupting the fragile peace? Could she allow her brother's happiness without letting the past hurt her again? Could she forgive, even partially, without betraying her children's trust? She pictured Vivian, standing at the doorway a year ago, calm and composed, trying to explain herself. She thought of Ethan clutching his locket, of Isabel holding tight to her rabbit, of the laughter that had returned to their home. The future was unwritten. It had always been. And then Clara realized something. The power wasn't in answering the question right now. It wasn't in deciding today, this evening, or even tomorrow. The power was in knowing that the choice belonged to her, and her alone. She could protect her children, set boundaries, and watch change without giving up control. Michael's hand rested lightly on her shoulder, grounding but not directing. He didn't speak. He simply reminded her that this was her life, her family, her decision to make in her own time. Clara breathed out again, feeling a strange calm in the uncertainty. She didn't need to know the answer tonight. She didn't need to decide whether Vivian would be allowed into their lives or kept at a careful distance. She only needed to hold her children, protect their happiness, and let time reveal the rest. The apartment grew darker as the night deepened, shadows stretching across walls and furniture. Ethan's soft breathing came from the bedroom. Isabel's small sighs followed. Clara sat on the couch, eyes fixed on nothing and everything at once, aware of the fragility of peace and the strength of love. Some questions had no immediate answers. Some chapters of life stayed unwritten. Clara knew she could face whatever came next, whether it was reconciliation, boundaries, or further conflict. She'd survived betrayal, prison, loss, and rebuilding. She'd learned patience, endurance, and strength. And in that moment, she realized the ending wasn't hers to control. It would unfold as it would, shaped by choices, actions, and the slow passage of time. All she could do was stay alert, protective, and ready for whatever came next. For now, the children were safe. The home was theirs. The past had been survived. The future was uncertain, open, and full of possibilities. Clara Bennett, stronger and wiser than she'd ever been, closed her eyes briefly, letting the quiet settle around her. The door stayed open, both figuratively and literally. Vivian's presence, Michael's plans, the children's growth, all of it waited for the decisions yet to come. And Clara, as she always had, would face it on her own terms. Because she'd learned the hardest lesson of all. Forgiveness, trust, and boundaries weren't simple. They were a path walked carefully, one step at a time. And the last word belonged to time, not her.